Hi there, I'm Tom Field, Senior Vice President of Editorial with Information Security Media Group. I want to welcome you to today's session entitled SolarWinds Breach. If cyber companies can get hit, do you stand a chance? Your presenter today is Jeremy Rasmussen. He's Chief Technology Officer with Abacode. And before I turn this over to Jeremy, let me give you a little bit of background on what he's going to talk with you about today. Scientists tell us that actual solar winds are heading toward Earth at 2 million kilometers per hour, and they've got the potential to knock out our satellites. But that's nothing compared to the hundreds of millions of dollars in losses across thousands of companies that are stacking up due to the recent SolarWinds attack. This webinar is going to discuss the effects the SolarWinds breach is having on the cybersecurity industry and its supply chain, with special focus on the cyber and tech vendors directly impacted. With new attacks happening every day, you'll also learn how your company can protect itself from SolarWinds fallout now, as well as how to prevent further attacks in the future. A little bit of background on my organization, Information Security Media Group. We're a 15-year-old company based in Princeton, New Jersey. You might know us best by one of our 30 or more international media sites. These include Bank Info Security, Healthcare Info Security, Data Breach Today. In all, we have an audience of 950,000 senior security leaders around the world, and we serve them unique content via media and events and intelligence every day. A few housekeeping notes. One, if you have any questions for Jeremy during the course of this session, you can submit them anytime by the chat window on your screen. If you should experience any technical difficulties, please dial the number on your screen. If you dial extension 107, we do have technical support staff standing by to help. And also, I have to say, the material that we present today is copyrighted material meant for today's session and individual study purposes only. If you or your organization would like to use any of the information we discussed today, or if you're looking for customized training materials, please contact us independently. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our sponsor today, Abacode. Abacode is a next-generation managed cybersecurity and compliance provider, leveraging a unified platform to help businesses of all sizes implement a holistic, framework-based cybersecurity program. Their unique service model enables their customers to transform cybersecurity challenges into their competitive advantage. Abacode works in collaboration with third-party audit, attestation, and certification bodies, where they complete the gaps needed to meet a compliance standard and manage the implementation and ongoing management of an entire program. Abacode's unified services platform is designed for ongoing compliance changes and updates, along with continuous cybersecurity monitoring and management. To learn more, please visit abacode.com. Now let's meet our speaker. Jeremy Rasmussen, again, is Chief Technology Officer of Abacode, again, a company that transforms security challenges into business competitive advantages. Abacode employs global thought leaders and industry experts in corporate governance, risk and compliance, ethical hacking, security operations, and incident response to provide its clients with a holistic view of cybersecurity. He also is an adjunct professor at the University of South Florida and founder of the USF White Hatters Computer Security Club. With that, let me turn you over now to Jeremy Rasmussen. Jeremy, the stage is yours.
Thanks, Tom. Really great to be with everybody today and talk about some of these issues that we've been seeing hit the news. Maybe talk about some of the things you can try to do immediately if you don't know where to start, and then talk about maybe what could you gain from working with a company like an Abacode, which is an MCCP, a new kind of breed of cybersecurity provider, managed cybersecurity and compliance provider, where we're converging two kind of disciplines together into one thing. So with that, let's take a look at some of the changing threatscape that's out there in the post-COVID world. There used to be this traditional notion of kind of this castle. Now, this has been going away for the last few years. Let's not fool ourselves. But definitely in the post-COVID world with the more work from home, this traditional view is really taken a knock, where you used to think you had kind of like a castle and the majority of your traffic, was behind the firewall and traversed through one opening, the firewall. And it was a clearly defined perimeter, and you could just simply apply, a policy across the entire enterprise. You had secure configurations for workstations, servers, and well-defined, challenges. Now, I didn't mean everybody was perfect back then, but it seemed like it was a simpler problem space. Nowadays, you have the majority of traffic outside the firewall. As you can see in the lower half of the picture there, and on the left-hand side, you've got all your mobile applications. You've got social media. You've got Zoom, like we're using right here. And early on, I remember in COVID, there was a lot of questions about Zoom. Where does the traffic go? How private is it? Are people using the right settings? You heard a lot about Zoom bombing, where people would find out the password to a session and post lewd things on there, or whatever. There's all kinds of security configurations at risk now, and these emerging and undefined security challenges that are outside the protected perimeter. And where is this perimeter anymore? I mean, now we have cloud computing, we have mobile computing, as I mentioned, social media. Probably enterprises don't even consider how much of their work they do on social media. You use LinkedIn for hiring and HR. You use Twitter for public interface and help desk support. You use Instagram and Facebook for public relations. So you're running a lot of your business on social media now, and yet there's no really visibility or IT control centralized over those those SaaS solutions. And that's what we come to find out when we do an assessment of a lot of companies, is that they kind of don't know where their important data are, where it's being processed, and definitely people are outside this notion of the protected perimeter. So the whole idea of a zero trust architecture, that used to be just kind of a buzz phrase that was coming around a few years ago, but that's got to be the new reality for us now. Zero trust meaning essentially there's an assumption of breach already. So a Navy ship has to keep floating and going to its destination, even if it has sprung a leak, right? So they know that these ships are made to continue on, even though they're compromised. In the same way, our networks and our infrastructure enterprises have to keep going, even if there's an attacker inside the system. So the way we do that is through segmentation, keeping this thing away from this thing, and making it harder for somebody to move laterally, applying authentication and multi-factor authentication methods everywhere, and also monitoring and scanning for indicators of compromise everywhere, and making sure there's no anomalous behavior. You've read about it in the news, and you've probably done a lot of research on what happened, and especially if you're a SolarWinds customer or user of that software. But even if you weren't, you probably have been in some way impacted, by the supply chain, downline supply chain fallout of this attack. So for the uninitiated, let's do a quick recap here. Back in December of 2020, the cybersecurity consulting company FireEye, they also have some solutions that they create. They found that they themselves had been compromised, and some of their tools had been stolen. And maybe attackers stubbed their toe by going after FireEye. That was a big mountain to climb there. But in so doing, they actually revealed how this had happened. And FireEye discovered that it was in the Orion software update to the SolarWinds platform is how the attackers got in and were able to compromise that with a Trojan horse. This was a very sophisticated attack that we suspect was perpetrated by nation state actors, advanced persistent threat actors. So initially they're saying they're Russians. I've also seen something about, maybe an add-on from the Chinese and some others. So there's probably just not one group involved, but multiple. SolarWinds is network management and telemetry software used by some 33,000 customers, and about 18,000 of them had installed this Trojanized update. So they were particularly, could have been compromised. We have seen a lot of companies that are actually cybersecurity companies that were users of SolarWinds, or were doing business with somebody that used SolarWinds, and they had some sort of trust relationship. So Qualys, Palo Alto, Mimecast, Fidelis, Malwarebytes, and according to Kevin Mandia from Mandia and FireEye, right, said maybe as many as 50 others. And then I heard another official, Ann Neuberger, former NSA Information Assurance Directorate person, said there could have been 100 more. So along with 8 federal agencies. So this is a widespread, very, very dangerous attack, probably one of the most wide-reaching and costly attacks we've ever seen. And the reason it's so dangerous is, you have a trust relationship with these software vendors, and you expect that when you're allowing them to introduce software into your environment, that it's going to be secure software and you trust it. And yet, so if it doesn't behave as you wanted it to, you've created a security hole. So this kind of goes to the fact that you never can depend on one point solution, right? You always have to have layers of security. And there's things we can do immediately in response to that. Before we talk about the specific things that you might need to do for SolarWinds, remediation, I should mention that a lot of people say, well, if I have cyber breach insurance, I'm covered. Well, let me address that. Certainly, you do need cyber breach insurance. I think it's necessary for anybody, and it's advised. And from the beginning, Abacode has been a big advocate of that, because we're going to do everything we can to prevent attacks from happening, to be proactive. We're going to try to detect them, and we're going to try to respond and improve whenever we see some incident occur. But nobody's perfect, right? Humans design systems, humans operate systems, and humans make mistakes. Therefore, when somebody makes a mistake, we're going to do the best job that we can to prevent, but something could happen. And then there you would want to have your breach insurance that's, kicks in and covers you in the case of one of these incidents. However, recently, and with the SolarWinds and other ones before that, we've seen insurance companies in the courts invoking this act of war clause. If they can prove that it's a nation state actor and this was an act of war, they actually have gotten out of paying some of the claim. Also, insurance is never going to pay out on a claim if you weren't doing the basics, right? If you didn't have any kind of security controls in place, due diligence at all, they're not going to cover that, and you're going to be left with the bill. So don't think that, cyber breach insurance is a cure-all. I hope it doesn't ever drive bad behavior. You do need it, but it should not be. That should be the last thing you think about. The first thing you think about should be, how can I be proactive and make sure these things can never happen to me? Obviously, installing the latest patches from SolarWinds, good idea. Running all your software non-privileged mode, making sure people aren't, clicking on bad links. I had heard some statistics the other day that somebody was telling me 70 or 80% of attacks still come through social engineering and phishing. That's actually maybe old news. I think a good portion of them still do come that way. But from my research and from working with other companies that do, ransomware remediation and actually working with some of these ransomware gangs to, if a ransom ever has to be paid, we find that something like 60% plus of these come through misconfiguration of remote access. So if you have a remote desktop or some kind of GoToMeeting or terminal services or whatever, you're providing a pipeline into your environment. And a lot of times that's not configured correctly. So you would like to whitelist that so it can only come in from a trusted site. You would also like to lock out, after some certain number of attempts to connect, because we see oftentimes, brute force password guessing, or we see what's called credential stuffing, which means they've gone out on the dark web and they've seen user IDs and passwords from another breach, and they find the same user ID on this system and they try the same one, and they might get the same, it might work because people tend to reuse passwords. So I think training users, not to click on links and not to visit untrusted websites is good. It's more important maybe not to reuse passwords, and also to implement two-factor authentication. We already talked about implementing some of the principles of zero trust. In addition, SIEM, security information and event management, is a very powerful tool that can be used, and I think should be used by any company that's serious about security. What SIEM does is it aggregates logs from all of your network infrastructure, firewall, servers, endpoint protection, cloud, SaaS, everything, and runs correlation rules on there, looking for indicators of compromise. But just having that in place is not enough. We've seen it before where we'll go into an organization and they have a SIM, and I'm like, can I log into the console? And I log in and I see 90,000 unattended alerts. So you have to have people behind it. You have to have a trained analyst workforce behind there, with tier one eyes on glass all the time, 24/7. Because by the way, these attacks don't happen, often in the middle of the day. They happen at night, on the weekends, during sporting events, during the Super Bowl, or on holidays. And so if you don't have people looking at stuff all the time, something's going to happen. You're going to miss it. Then you also have to have that second tier of people working with the tier one analyst to see if things need to be escalated and how to escalate those things and how to respond to the incident, who to call, and how to correctly remediate. Then you have the tier three people, which are the graybeards like me, or really good, smart guys and gals who are very good at understanding how these threats work, and they're doing the deep dive malware analysis in terms of looking at registry entries change, processes spawned, files dropped, network connections out, and looking at to see how this malware really works, or how the attacker has been doing what they do to be able to stop it. So looking for those things on a regular basis and being able to respond to them in near real time, that's a huge issue. Getting a little bit more into a deep dive, technical analysis, the questions are, looking to see if your systems have connected out to any command and control sites. And by the way, even though this SolarWinds attack was fairly sophisticated, they did a good job at covering their tracks, interleaving their traffic with regular network traffic, so it'd be hard to detect. Also using a lot of domain names that looked just like the real ones that you might go to for updates, maybe off by one character. Very, very clever. But just like with ransomware gangs, there's a playbook they use of TTP, tools, techniques, and practices. And if we study those through an approach like the MITRE ATT&CK framework, we can see that in general, attackers are always going to try to gain a foothold through finding and exploit. They're going to do some reconnaissance first and find some way to get into a system. The ways that I just mentioned, is it going to be a misconfigure remote access, or they're going to phish somebody? That's the two biggest ways, most likely. Sometimes you have deprecated hard software running on operating systems or services that are exposed to the internet, and they find these unpatched or they find these out of date, and there's a known exploit out there, and they'll use those to get in. But those are the primary ways. Once they have a foothold, they're going to want to get some sort of persistence or backdoor on the system so they can continue to use it. Oftentimes, we actually see them patch the vulnerability that allowed them to get in the first place, because they don't want any other attackers coming in and taking over the system that they now own, right? They're going to try to move laterally, escalate privileges, establish command and control, exfiltrate data, disable your antivirus or endpoint protection, and all sorts of other things. It's a playbook. Any of those things along that kill chain. Oh yeah, by the way, and the very last thing to do, of course, is encrypt your files, charge you some Bitcoin ransom to get them back, or threaten to dox you, right? We're going to put all your customers' data out there on the web, and you're going to be embarrassed unless you pay us some ransom. Well, all of those things have indicators of compromise that we can look for and detect in the kill chain. And that's the game we play, is trying to see those as early as possible. We're not saying nothing's ever going to happen, but by the time encryption starts to happen, that's the end of the game, and you've lost. I would say, knock on wood, none of our managed services customers has ever suffered significant financial loss. I'm not saying they haven't been attacked and there haven't been incidents that we've helped address, but we do see these IOCs, and we help contain them, remediate, and we always do a post-mortem after every event to make sure that we are cleaning up the problem that caused the incident to occur. So when you're looking at SIM alerts, they're going to say something along the lines of, we see some credentials being entered into a website. But what's that really an indicator of? Well, somebody probably got phished and got redirected to a fake, website where they thought they were logging into the real company website, but they weren't. And we can immediately see that, and we can say, reset their passwords, log them out everywhere, implement. But the deeper issue is they really probably need two-factor authentication and training, right? And in the same way, when we see those remote desktop and remote access misconfiguration issues, the alert is, oh, it's a brute force password attack. But the deeper issue is you've got a serious security flaw in your architecture, and you need to address that. So we always look for the underlying issues and try to fix those. We've talked about kind of the new post-COVID environment. We've talked about some of the challenges that came out of the SolarWinds breach. And by the way, right, this is if malware bites and Mimecast and FireEye and all these guys got hit, do you think you're not going to be hit? It's not as, they're the best at what they do in the cybersecurity game. And a lot of times, many companies don't have nearly that level of expertise in understanding the threats or dealing with them. So it's not a matter if you're going to get hit, or it's when and how ready you're going to be prepared, to deal with the threat. A lot of people think, oh, well, I'm not FireEye, so they wouldn't come after me. But there's two types of attacks. There's indiscriminate, where they're just, they hire groups. These ransomware gangs will hire groups of threat hunters to go out, or not threat hunters, I would say red teamers, people that will go out and just probe sites at random to see if they can find anything. And if they are able to compromise something, then they hand off the site to the ransomware gang that will come in and encrypt all the files and charge the ransom. But there's also, of course, targeted attacks where they're looking at specifically companies doing certain types of work. Maybe in the healthcare industry, they know hospitals have a life or death mission. They're going to pay the ransom. We also talked recently to a company that made software for critical infrastructure, and of course they're like, well, we're only a 50-person software company. Why would they come after us? Well, because you're part of the supply chain for critical infrastructure, and the nation state wants to attack critical infrastructure, so they're going to attack you. And just like the SolarWinds attack, maybe they can Trojanize your updates and get to your end customers. So people just don't realize everyone's a target, everyone, and you're not exempt. And if you're not, and even if you are the best of the best, you can still get hit. So that's the new normal. That's what we have to deal with. Let's look at some of the other drivers in this emerging, cyber landscape. Well, we just said people in the supply chain. Compliance is now a part of doing business. If there's a small auto parts company making parts for one of the big three automakers, one of those big automakers in Detroit is going to say, you must meet some certain, if I'm going to have a trust relationship with you and share B2B information, you must meet some level of due diligence in securing that data. So I may have intellectual property that we share, or financials, or even personally identifiable information. I need to know that you're taking care of it to the level that I take care of the data. And if you can't prove that to me, you're not going to get the contract. So now, if you're talking about spending, $150,000, $200,000 on cybersecurity, that sounded like a really lot of money, for a small business before. But if you're saying you're not going to get the $10 million contract from the automaker unless you do this, well, now it's kind of a no-brainer, right? The return on investment is a huge multiple. And that's the case with the federal government. In the DoD right now, unless you show that you can comply with the cyber maturity model certification, CMMC, if you can't comply with the requirements of NIST 800-171 for controlling, controlled unclassified information to the extent that they want it to be protected, you're not going to get any new contracts with the DoD. Pretty soon, we're going to see that extended to the entire federal government. And then, who knows in the future if we're going to see this come out for, the broader public and everyone doing business. There's already industries that have regulatory compliance mandates, definitely healthcare, banking, education, and some others. But it's funny when we work with industries that aren't necessarily one of those, they think they don't have to do anything. Well, if you're ever collecting any data about consumers, the FTC says you have to protect that data. We're going to fine you if you get breached. And we're going to see more and more, lawsuits and regulatory mandates coming out, and that are going to kind of drive this behavior. Of course, the ever increasing complexity of vendors and technology and compliance landscape. Let me tell you, if you've ever gone to, now we've been missing they have virtual events now. We've been missing going to Black Hat briefings and RSA conference and some of these giant security conferences. But if you've ever gone to the vendor expo hall there, you see 500 vendors. And you're like, what do they all do? They have some solution that is sure to solve your security problem. But unless you have somebody looking at the holistic, big picture for you and what you need to meet your business mission, you might take the plunge on a tool or resource that's not really going to solve your problem at all. In fact, it might make it worse. You really need kind of a trusted advisor who can help look at your business needs first and your technology needs second, and help you make those smart choices that are more strategic than tactical. The increasingly hostile threat environment, obviously, we've been talking about that today with the SolarWinds breach and so forth. You really need somebody that can stay on top of that and do the research, and somebody that presents papers, writes papers, goes to conferences and symposia, and has a environment of continuous learning. Unless you are on top of that and on the cutting edge all the time, you're not going to be able to keep pace with what they're doing. Think about this: if the attackers are making tens of billions of dollars a year from their cyber crime, if they even put a fraction of that back into R&D to get better at what they do, they're way ahead of you and me, right? And any company in its capability of keeping pace. So you really need the experts on your side, and unless you can dedicate the money and the resources to keep to do that research for yourself, you're going to be behind. IT people are smart. They're great at implementing the network, installing users, updating, and all that stuff. But they're more operations focused. Cybersecurity is a distinct thing from IT. IT and IT security, two separate things. IT is like the central nervous system of the body, and IT security is like your immune system. You need both of them to function, but they're separate. And there has to be that separation of duties. An IT person that's wearing two hats is always going to miss something. And in fact, they're kind of checking their own work, right? As a professor at the University of South Florida, I don't let the students grade their own papers for a good reason. They would all get A's, right? So IT cannot check its own work and make sure that it's doing the right things. You really need a third party to come in, verify what they're doing is the right thing, and provide that support and that another set of eyes always watching and having their back, complementing what they do. We've talked about some of the emerging regulation at the state level. We see there's 3 states, California, New York, Nevada have already passed very heavy, onerous privacy laws, and we're seeing 17 states with pending legislation around that. Are you able to keep up with all that if you're doing business, in multiple states? What about internationally? Are you doing any work with the European Union? Then you fall under GDPR. And just keeping pace with that is a full-time job. As we said before, you're not going to be able to find the people to do the work. There's a 4 million person worldwide shortage of cybersecurity talent right now, probably at least 500,000 in the US. And even in the state of Florida, where I'm from, we're saying 30,000. I heard the other day that the Florida Cyber, which is the Florida Center for Cybersecurity, which is a state legislature funded Center of Excellence, is starting to an initiative to really push cybersecurity education starting at the elementary level, which I think is great, because back when say I was in college, I'm a computer science major, we didn't have a cybersecurity degree at all. That's a relatively new thing, and so even if we turned out 5,000 computer security, cybersecurity graduates a year now, we wouldn't be able to keep pace. So we really need to start younger, start looking at educating and having a cybersecurity career path begin, at the earliest ages. But for the time being, you simply can't find these qualified resources, right? To run your own security operations center, you would need at least 2 people for 3 shifts. That's 6 people, plus maybe 2 more on governance, risk, and compliance and operations. Let's just say a team of 8 would be the minimum you would need to run a proper cybersecurity program for any company. Are you able to hire, let's just say, round numbers, $100,000 a head? Are you able to hire $800,000 of dedicated cybersecurity staff right now? Probably most small to mid-sized businesses would say no. But if you hire an expert team for probably about the price of 1 to 1.5 FTEs, you could get that whole team behind you. So that's kind of a no-brainer. I think we've already covered most of this. If you look at that little quote in the bottom left, we just read recently, 83% of IT leaders have seen the wisdom of this and are looking to outsource cybersecurity to managed security providers this year. We talked about this a little bit earlier on, but a traditional managed security services provider would give you virtual security operations, alerting and reporting capability. The more advanced security provider has evolved that to include what's called MDR, managed detection and response. So they have the capability of doing some work around active response, stopping things. So if you saw an attack happening, you could triage it and then maybe take a system offline, scan it, eradicate the malware, put up firewall rules, things like that. The future is aligning all of this with the best practices framework. So that's not 2 distinct disciplines anymore: GRC, governance, risk and compliance, and cybersecurity. Those are now converged. So, for example, security operations could have alerts from the compliance portal showing that there are compliance items that are out of date. For example, compliance is not a one-time fire and forget. Let's discuss that first. Compliance is a continuous process. It has to always be updated. So, for example, if the compliance mandate is you must train your users for cybersecurity awareness, that has to be done annually, at least, and maybe even more often than that. So collecting an artifact saying, okay, we trained everybody, that was for last year. It's going to have to be done this year as well and next year. So that artifact has to be collected. We have to prove that we've met it. So continuous monitoring could say, we've popped up an alert saying we're out of compliance in this, it needs to be done. Conversely, as the security operations is doing reporting of how many incidents were detected, escalated, triaged, and so forth, that data can be driven and fed back into the compliance portal where you're maintaining a record of this continuous monitoring. So I think this is an emerging field where we're seeing, Abacode is one of the key players here in an example of the new MCCP paradigm. When we're talking about MCCP, managed cybersecurity and compliance providers, what do we think the core services are that you need? And these are the core services. We didn't make these up. These all align with cybersecurity best practices as seen through, for example, the Center for Internet Security Top 20 or the National Institute of Standards and Technology Cybersecurity Framework for Critical Infrastructure Protection, or ISO 27001. All of these have basically an overlap of 80-90% of the same things in them. What we're saying is you need some sort of security framework and gap assessment against a standard. You need to implement controls and processes. You need a formalized set of policy. This just can't be a grassroots effort of the IT team. This has to be throughout the organization. If this doesn't start at the top down and have management involvement and teeth behind it, it's not going to happen. So policies and procedures have to go throughout the organization, not just for the IT. You need eyes on glass managed detection and response through SIEM, Security Information Event Management, and SOC, Security Operations Center 24/7. You need a regular vulnerability scanning, a program of looking for patches and remediating. You need to do both external and internal assessments. So external is how an attacker would see your enterprise from the outside in terms of public facing IPs. Internal is your patches and configurations and everything for your operating systems, applications, and so forth, wherever those are, on premises, in a data center, in the cloud, or through SaaS solutions. On a regular basis, you should have an external and internal penetration test. That's going to again show you. So whereas blue teaming exercises are collaborative between the assessment team and the IT management, where we're working together towards shoring up vulnerabilities and misconfigurations. Red teaming, which is external penetration testing, is really coming in stealthy, unannounced, covertly, and like an attacker would, and seeing if you can do all those things we talked about earlier: gain a foothold, gain persistence, escalate privileges, maybe find some flag to capture critical data in the environment. We've said before, you need training and awareness for your employees for rank and file. I would also say you need probably deep dive training for developers. If you're doing any custom development of hardware and software, you want to build in security as part of your overall quality assurance, lifecycle development process. Compliance management, you want to make sure that the things we said before, you're on top of all the time, that you're maintaining and collecting artifacts, you're assigning roles and responsibilities, and you're dashboarding all this with visual management so that executive leadership can see, this is what we've done so far, this is how close we are to compliant, and this is how much we have left to go. Another thing that's great about visual management is that it provides compelling kind of quantitative ROI for your security spend. If we've spent this much and our risk has reduced from this much down to this much, now I know what I'm getting for that security spend. Sometimes I think in the past, CFOs have probably felt like security is just this black hole they just keep pouring money into, and they don't know what they're getting back, in return for it. But by having, a managed service provider where you're paying basically one monthly or yearly fee, you know exactly what you're spending, and what your breaches or losses are, resulting protection, preventing those breaches or loss. In addition, we also, an MCCP should have the capability to provide, very deep level chief information security officer advice on security architecture, remediations, as well as being, having a team on deck and ready to go if anything happened, and from a forensics and incident response standpoint. So all of this is how we see MCCP as a core program. There are additional add-ons, but this is going to get you probably 90% of the way there on any kind of compliance standard, either the CIS top 20, NIST, CSF, or ISO 27001. If you have this core program in place, you're almost there. There's always little things here and there that we can do to tweak it and to help you mature along the way, because it's a journey, right? It's a continuous journey. It's not a one-time fire and forget, as we've said. All right, so that's kind of a quick drink from the fire hose look at the current threatscape, what we're trying to do about it from an MCCP standpoint, and some practical advice for securing your systems. So I'll throw it back to Tom now.
Excellent, Jeremy. Thanks so much. Really appreciate your time, your insight, your presentation. And a reminder, we can take some questions. If you haven't sent questions in yet, do so now via the chat window on your screen. We can't get to every question in the time we have left, but for those that we don't answer within the course of this session, we will get responses back to you via email. That said, I do have a couple of questions, Jeremy, and one is following up on what you were talking about with emerging regulations. I know there's a lot of pending privacy regulation among US states, might even be discussed at a federal level. What sorts of regulatory trends are you keeping an eye on that could impact how supply chain security is looked at later this year?
Yeah, so CCPA, California Consumer Privacy Act, New York Shield Act, GDPR, which is in the European Union, General Data Privacy Regulation. I have to remember all these acronyms, soup for everything. Those are all about how do you collect and transfer onto third parties and maintain the integrity of private data about individuals and companies actually too, because there's business, private data as well, financial transactions and so forth. Cybersecurity is what gives privacy teeth. Without security guaranteeing the confidentiality, integrity, availability, authentication, non-repudiation, access control of that data, privacy is not going to happen. So even though sometimes the regulation may be about privacy, it's really about cybersecurity as well, and making sure that you're doing your utmost to protect that data, monitor that data, and make sure that nobody can get to it or change it or transfer it onto third parties without being able to authorize that. So again, as you mentioned, and 17 states with pending regulation right now. There's some talk about federal legislation pending. Let's keep our eye on that. I think most people would be against more regulation. I'm kind of a small government person myself, but in this case, if there's people that aren't doing anything, they ought to be doing something, especially if they're collecting private data about citizens and they're not, doing due diligence to protect their customers' data. We probably need to see at least some minimal, government standards at the federal level as well. Maybe not along the lines of what we're seeing with CMMC amongst DoD contractors, but at least something.
Jeremy, that was one of my follow-up questions about the maturity model with the DoD. Could you envision a time when all of federal government is requiring similar standards for those organizations that want to do business with the U.S.?
Yes, absolutely. A few years ago, when they first came out with the NIST 800-171, which is the controls for protecting CUI, controlled unclassified information, we actually spoke to the authors of that documentation. And interestingly, that program was run out of the National Archives of all places. But they had told us at the time that the initial version of that was intended for DoD contractors to comply with the DFARS, the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation guidelines about protecting data with due diligence and also incident response reporting. But the intent at that time was that it would soon be applied to all, like GSA.gov. It would be applying to all federal contractors of any agency you're working with. So I can't see it not happening. I think that is coming down the pike at some point. And so here's the big difference. For a long time, they were letting you self-assert, self-assess. Now they're saying you're going to have a third party come in and attest to the fact that you're doing all these things that you say you've been doing all along anyway. I think when they spot checked against the NIST 800-171, they had like a 90% failure rate of people that were saying that they were doing the right things. So that was the impetus for saying we must have a third party attestation here. So we can definitely see that coming down the pike for all federal agencies for sure.
Hey, Jeremy, one more question. To some extent, almost any organization is someone else's supplier. We're all part of the supply chain. Do you see pressure coming from the supply chain itself to improve supply chain security?
In certain industries, yes, but that's a great question. I think I've been teaching, information security principles for 20 plus years now. And I've always talked about managing trust relationships at a business to business level. When you, if you ever have a trust relationship, either, back in the day, it was an extranet connection into your environment, or, anything where you're sharing data, you have to carefully control, manage, and segment that part of your environment away from everything else. A great example would be some years ago, there was a company here in Lakeland, Florida that made the technology for airbag deployments. They actually had all the patents for the little explosive device, or the accelerometer and the little explosive device to deploy the airbags. And since they had the patent, all the automakers had to work with them, even in other countries, Toyota and Kia and whoever were coming to them to implement this airbag technology into those cars. And think about this, they would have 5-year out project plans and engineering plans for some of these emerging vehicles that hadn't even hit the streets yet, because they had to be able to integrate their technology. Imagine the difficulty they had in segmenting all these automaker data that they're all rivals with each other and all hated each other, right? Another example was I met the chief information security officer for the U.S. Senate, and he said, imagine you have 100 different senators, each with their own little network, and 50 of them hate the other 50, right? And so again, the same issue of how do you not intermingle data? How do you segment? How do you authenticate? Those are the same issues. Those are kind of a microcosm of the supply chain issues that we continue to see. But I think the same principles have always applied. Segment, multi-factor authentication, monitoring, watching everything that's happening, and being able to step in and stop anything and contain it when it happens. As defenders, we have to, defend 1,000 ways into the castle, and the attacker only has to find one way in. So it's going to happen. They're going to get in. How quickly you can detect, respond, recover, and improve for the future, that's going to be the key.
Very good. Jeremy, appreciate your time and insight, and thanks for answering these questions as well.
Absolutely. Pleasure meeting with you today, Tom.
And attendees, I want to thank you for attending our session today. We appreciate that it takes a good deal of time out of your day to attend this, but I'm confident you got some new insights, some new ideas that you can put back to work to help tackle the challenges of supply chain security. For Information Security Media Group, I'm Tom Field. Thanks again for attending today.